This is Duke University.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Molly Starback, Director of the Office of Postdoctoral Services. Thank you very much for coming today. This session is co-sponsored by the Duke Career Center and the Duke Graduate School, and as you know, it's also an RCR forum. So those of you who want RCR credit, make sure you have your pink sheets. And today our session is going to be led off by Dr. Sally Kornbluth, the Vice Dean for Basic Sciences, and the incoming Provost for Duke University. Yay! So she's going to give a presentation that will last about 45 minutes. After that, we will be joined by panelists from academia and industry to answer questions. Our panelists are Dr. Mohammed Noor, the Professor and Chair of the Duke Department of Biology, Dr. Jessica Monserrate, Scientist at Baird Crop Science and former Duke postdoc, and Dr. Susan Smith, Scientific Investigator at Stiefel at GSK Company, so also a former Duke postdoc. So yay to our postdocs who made good. And we're going to lead off with a few questions. Many of you submitted your questions in advance. Thank you for doing that. So we'll start off with those, and then we'll take questions from you, the audience. I will note that some of you submitted questions like, how do I get a job in industry? How do I get a faculty job? Those are outside the scope of this discussion, but we have held panels on both of those topics. You can find them on the Duke Postdoc Services YouTube channel. All right, so without further ado, we will welcome Sally Kornbluth. I'm going to turn on the lights a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Molly. My apologies to anyone who's actually seen this before, because it will sound very familiar. I'm going to talk today in general terms about how to manage a lab or a research group, and I just wanted to point out these books because I've drawn some material from them, and I think they're nice things to have a look at. One is At the Helm by, there's a pointer on here.
Oh, you may have to turn it on. There's a switch on the side of the thing.
One is At the Helm by Kathy Barker, and there's also another book that she's put out called At the Bench, which is really great for people who are starting in the lab. And then this book by Burroughs Wellcome, and actually our own Mohammed Noor, who we'll hear from today, also recently published a book called You're Hired, Now What? A Guide for New Faculty. And so I recommend you take a look at Mohammed's book, which is actually more recent than these two.
And available from the postdoc office.
Available from the postdoc office. All right. And Molly only takes a small cut, so. Okay, so this is familiar to most people. When you arrive at a new job, you're going to have something that looks like this, or at least this is a traditional lab setup. And what you're going to need to have is projects, people, and eventually money to parlay this into these. So the idea is to take the resources available to you and most efficiently use them to do great science and hopefully publish them in great journals to share with the scientific community. Now, people define success in different ways. What I'm talking about really is success in academia. If you're going to lead an academic lab, what's going to be a successful outcome? You have to have publications, obviously. Eventually, in order to get tenure, you're going to have letters of recommendation from your peers, and obviously you're going to have funding. Now, I'm going to make some of these points as we go through, but I want to make a couple points right now, which is a lot of people come from laboratories where everything is a home run. They publish papers in Cell, Science and Nature, et cetera, et cetera. Singles count. When you first start your lab, I think what a lot of people do is they are used to being in a situation where they hold all their data, they wait till the latest, they wait till the greatest breaking news, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom line is when you're starting, you have to get your stories out, and you're going to have people in your lab that may not be quite as good as you are. They might not even be capable of getting a huge story. So just bear in mind that it's important to do good solid work as well as the huge flashy work and publish it. You're going to need letters of recommendation. As I said, it's very important, even though people are often hesitant when they're first starting a research group to go to meetings. It's very, very important. Email is obviously a huge way of communication now. And calling up colleagues to ask them advice or talk to them about your work is a really good way to get to know others in your field. And also, you can invite, often if you're a new faculty member, you have the opportunity to invite speakers. Take advantage of inviting people that will help your research career. At a big research university like Duke, teaching is still important. Minimally, you have to be a competent teacher. Obviously, it helps if you're excellent. This is not only because you're teaching, but it really helps to get excellent people in your lab, particularly students if you're an excellent teacher. I will say, keep very good records of everything you do, your teaching, your service, etc., and make sure you ask for teaching evaluations. I have to say, when I came up for tenure, I had not kept good records. I couldn't remember what I had taught, what service I had done, and I was going back over 6 years of my calendar, to find where I had been and what I had done. Not a good idea to do it that way. Important to do in-house service, and also, as you kind of rise in the ranks a little bit outside service, oftentimes people will be asked to do NIH study section ad hoc, or reviewers for journals, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very good way to get out in the community. Now, the main topic of today's talk is really about how you manage a lab and how you run a successful lab. The most important thing, obviously, is what people you bring in. You're the most important person there as PI. Why you? Why are they even giving you this job? Obviously, the first thing is scientific skills. Okay, you're really hired for what your scientific acumen has been. And you're going to have to do experiments, analyze data, write up data. At least at the beginning, you're going to have to do some experiments. Some people leave the bench pretty early. You're hired really also for your confidence, resilience, integrity, and communication skills. And this is something that they don't always teach you in a postdoc. But your sort of communication and management skills are going to be as important to your success as your scientific skills. And the other thing that I think people, particularly in this funding environment, is often underappreciated is persistence. You really have to keep trying, and often you will have to deal with difficult people, and you just you have to be persistent with getting them where they need to go and where you need them to go. Okay, so what do you have to do as the PI? You obviously have to set the scientific direction, as I said, pick the right people, get money, and cheerlead. If you're a pessimist, your lab will, go down the drain. You're the one who has to keep everybody's spirits up all of the time, and that doesn't come naturally to everybody. And so it's worth it as you think about how you're going to manage a group. How are you going to keep people's spirits up? Because the truth of the matter is that 99% of experiments don't work, and people will get depressed pretty quickly. So it's really important to do that. Now, with people, you have to pick them, you have to manage them, and this sounds a little bit Machiavellian, but you're having a lab, you have a research agenda, you really have to think about how to get what you want from people, and that will often be an individually tailored thing because not everybody's motivated by the same things. And then it's really important, and both for the long-term health of your lab and also just as your duty as a professional, you have to guide and mentor them. In other words, you have to give them what they need. So advising is kind of a dual-edged sword. You have to help them, but they have to help you. And then, unfortunately, you have to fire them if it doesn't work out. And that has not been my strongest suit, I have to say, in general. Probably lucky for the people in my lab, but, our motto used to be full employment in the Kornbluth lab, but things morph over time and money has gotten a little bit tighter. So what kind of lab do you want to have? Right people, how many? So usually when a lab is starting, you have a kind of array of either technicians, students, or postdocs, and you have to think a little bit about whether you want technicians. So at the very beginning, I had a technician who actually did experiments. I haven't really had that since then because I found that, we have a great technician who takes care of a lot of the reagents in the lab and takes care of the animals, but we don't have someone who actually does the experiments. And that's because I found that I never gave precise enough instructions to actually get a good experiment done. In other words, with a student or postdoc, I can give a general idea, we can talk through the principles, but if I had to come down to, make sure you add this or do this or whatever, I was always forgetting a detail that would almost ensure the experiment would fail. So I found that my ability to work with technicians was not that great. If you do want a technician, and at the beginning it's great because there's all this ordering to do and setting up to do, etc. Word of mouth is one of the easy ways. Tell your colleagues. HR now, Depends on the HR at the place you're at. Some places are great, some places are not so great. You're going to get a slew of applications. You have to comb through what, what you want in a technician. Now, I actually, strangely enough, got my first technician through an ad in the News and Observer. It was at the time that GSK was laying off a lot of people, et cetera. I knew there were going to be great technicians on the market. And sure enough, I got someone who lived in Raleigh who was working at GSK who saw the ad, and she was terrific. She actually wound up leaving the lab ultimately because she got a big money offer at another pharmaceutical company, but it was very productive for a few years. It's important to get recommendation letters, find out their work experience. Duke has something which a lot of places have. There's a temp service, and I actually have had several successful, when I really wanted someone for a short period of time, to use a temp tech. But it's also a great thing for auditioning. If you have a temporary technician opportunity, you can bring someone in for 3 months where you can see how they work out. You pay a bit of a premium, but the good thing is you can tell if they're good or not before you hire them on as a permanent employee. And if they're not good, sort of, no harm, no foul, they can leave without, having to worry about you firing someone. Anyway, you also have to think about whether you want them to have their own projects. Sometimes techs come in who are fairly independent, or whether you want them to help you or others in the lab. The one thing I didn't list here also that I'm going to make as a sort of pan statement, when you're hiring someone, call their references. A lot of times people will put something in a letter that they will not put something in a letter that they'll tell you on the phone. And one person, I almost hired it as a technician when I first got here, fantastic references, called the PI she was working for. Lovely conversation, went on for about half an hour, and about the 29th minute she admitted that she would never hire her. So sometimes you can sort of tease that out in a conversation. And now obviously you want people who are smart, organized, not high maintenance. So I'm going to say this over and over again. There are good people who are very dramatic. You have to decide if you can tolerate that. In a technician, it's not good, I can tell you, because they tend to keep the whole lab stirred up by the drama. Important for them to have good hands, strong work ethic, and enthusiasm. Interview everybody in person. Never hire somebody, particularly for a technician job, that you cannot interview. Students, in a place like Duke, the graduate students play a huge role. There's a lively, large graduate program, and as a starting PI, you don't always get top postdocs. It's going to be very important to have great students. Now, there's a little bit of politics around this, because you can email new students to tell them you're here, or when I first got here, you could put mailings in student boxes, but obviously the system cannot tolerate every single PI, advertising their lab. You're going to alienate all of your colleagues. Now, the best thing as a starting PI is to go through the program directors or the DGSA equivalents and say, look, I'm new here, would you mind sending out my research interests to people in the program, just announcing that I'm a new faculty member? Most people are willing to do that, and it's a lot more palatable than you kind of shopping your wares around to people. It's very important at the beginning of the year. There are often social events. Here we have the Beaufort Retreat. It's great to be involved in that. If you ever have the opportunity to give departmental presentations, be part of a seminar series, you can ask colleagues. When I first got here, I told, at the time it was Anne-Marie Pendergast and, Pat Casey, who did things that were, related to what I was doing, and they were just besieged with student interest all the time. Pat used to get 18 rotation students wanting to come to his lab. So I was like, look, can you, kick some of the people my way? You take the first choice that you want, and send some of the people my way. And it actually worked out really well. In fact, I tease Pat now because one of these first people that he turned away was my first student. She's now a tenured faculty member at UCSD. She was fabulous. But you just don't always know. And then you have to, it's funny, when you're starting a lab, when you talk to students, you tell them how great it is to have a small lab with a PI who's really involved, use that. Then when you're more senior, you tell them how great it is to be in a big lab with lots going on, etc. But, you really want to kind of, emphasize your strengths and sell it to the students. At Duke and at many, many other places now, there are rotations where students, sort of audition your laboratory as well as you auditioning them. I'll say something I think important to think about when you have rotation students. Don't make it a generic project. The worst thing for a student is to come and clone and insert into a plasmid, or get a, well now I guess people don't sequence themselves. I guess a project would be to send something out. But the point is, don't do something generic. Do something that highlights your system. So for many years my lab worked almost exclusively using the Xanthus egg extract system, and that was something they weren't going to get in other laboratories. So I could tell right away if it was going to be something appealing to them, because if they looked under the microscope at a synthetic nucleus formed in vitro and didn't go, wow, I was like, it was over. So they, you need to have people who want to work on what you have. The other thing is you need to think about whether it's self-contained with your supervision. Early on, students are going to come to a starting PI because they're going to get one-on-one interaction with the PI who's going to really supervise their project. Later on, you're going to have more people in the lab, and generally what you want to do is append the rotation student to an appealing team. Some people that they're going to see themselves working with going forward. The other thing is, some probability of data that, you can't guarantee a project's going to work, particularly in some time, as short as a rotation. But it's important that there's like some chance it's going to work, or they're going to be very frustrated. Now, how do you decide whether to take a student after they rotate? For me, it's always been very important to others in the lab like them. If the answer to that is no, I never take someone. Obviously, they have to be intelligent, good hands, etc., enthusiastic. This I learned the hard way over many years. Can they get a single piece of data? Now, I don't mean like a great piece of data in the sense that it's an important result, because that's a little bit much to expect out of a rotation. I mean an interpretable piece of data. So if you can't tell whether their gel is showing a band or not, or a piece of dirt or whatever, I can tell you it's going to be like that for 5 years. So, it's people tend to kind of establish their work patterns, etc. It's very important to say, can they get at least a piece of data that you can discuss and is interpretable, even if it's not a biologically important result. Here's some red flags, and I took this from the Burroughs Wellcome HHMI book. If they're unwilling to take responsibility for their own actions, in other words, they've crashed the centrifuge, and it's like, well, it wasn't me, someone left the bucket, with buffer at the bottom of it, and that kind of thing. If someone's already complaining about others in the lab to you, it's not going to get better. If they're demanding privileges, like I only want to work on, alternative Tuesdays from 2 to 5 because, I'm doing X, Y, and Z, not good. Evasiveness. So the worst thing in a lab person is if they will not share their data with you openly. If they are already saying, well, I don't want to show it to you, it didn't look good, or I didn't really do it that way, I can't, etc., not a good idea. That's sort of coupled with memory loss about experiments. So, if I remember the details of their experiment much better than they do, that's a red flag. Oh, I don't really remember if I, used salt or didn't use salt, washed the pellets, didn't wash the pellets, that kind of thing. And high absenteeism obviously is a problem, particularly at the beginning. If you're always looking for them and they're nowhere to be found, that's a bad sign. How do you turn down someone who really wants to join your lab? And this was from the Kathy Barker book. The advice that people gave me that is incredibly true, but incredibly hard to follow, is not to hire people when you first start out. It's such a strong impulse. You have this empty lab, you just want to fill it up so it looks busy. But you often get people who are really bad. It's hard to apply the kind of criteria you should in the beginning with people. It's better to have nobody than to have bad people. You might turn them down because they're incompetent. It's really not nice to tell people that you're turning them down because they're incompetent. There's probably a better way to say that. Often, you just have too many people. And I've turned down people who are talented individuals that really need more supervision than I'm going to be able to give them, or that the lab is going to be able to absorb. Again, you might not take them because people don't like them, but mostly it's because it's a bad fit with needs for supervision or your time. Or you may be someone who just does not really, this isn't going to happen in the beginning, but later on you may not have a suitable project for really a beginner. Like let's say you do, I don't know, some kind of intricate animal surgery where you don't have the time or inclination to train people, but you have really good postdocs who can do it. If they don't want to train someone either, you're kind of in a bind to make it a productive experience. Now, what about postdocs? So, postdocs with the student stipends coming up, postdocs and students don't cost that much. The difference isn't that much as it used to be. And when you have a limited budget, you have to think about what the best way to spend it. Now, first thing you have to ask, particularly when you're starting out, depending on where you are geographically, it may be hard to attract really good postdocs. So you have to ask, if the place has a really good student program, are the postdocs better than the students? What's the postdoc's background? I've, in the past, had the experience where a postdoc really wasn't trained the way that I would have wanted to train them, and then it came out, as they were in the lab, that, there was definitely a different philosophy. So what techniques do they have in hand? How smart are they? It's very important to have them give a seminar and do an interview with the people in your lab. Excuse me, when I, ask questions at an interview, postdoc seminar, especially if it's an area that I don't know that much about and I feel like they don't have a really in-depth knowledge, you can't explain what they're doing, that's a red flag. As I said, recommendation letters and phone calls, your personality is going to jive with someone or not jive, and I think that's a really important point. And realize, though, that the postdocs need different things from a student. If you are going to be someone who does not want reagents or projects to leave your laboratory, with a student, it's easy because they often go on to do a postdoc in an unrelated area, and you don't have to break off a piece of your work. With a postdoc, you owe it to them when you take them, particularly if they want to go on in academia, to make it possible for them to bring a project with them when they start a lab. And if you're not willing to do that, it's not a good idea to have a postdoc because it's going to be very difficult for them to get started. And then, postdocs can often get independent funding, and that is a criteria. If you think someone's very fundable, it helps a lot because it will obviously alleviate the budget pressures on your lab. Now, your role is, again, not only to get work from your people, but to really mentor them. This is from Burroughs' Welcome Book. Scientific mentoring is a personal one-on-one relationship between a more experienced scientist and a junior scientist or scientist in the making. The mentor is exposed to the trainee's energy and ideas, and the trainee receives the guidance and encouragement necessary for professional development. So as you mentor, you have to think about what your mentoring style is. And I say this over and over again, which is the lab takes on the personality of the PI. The style that the PI, and you're limited, one way or the other by your own personality, the style with which you want to mentor is going to have a long-term effect on your laboratory. So how accessible do you want to be? When I was an assistant professor, my office was open all the time. My feet were up on the desk. People were in and out all the time. Totally open accessibility. Now with an administrative job, I'm really busy. I see people on a very fixed schedule, although if someone emails me or calls me or texts me or whatever, we find a way to meet. But it's not the, sit around the lab with your feet up, kind of just, shooting the breeze about scientific ideas. How open-minded are you going to be as a mentor? How consistent are you going to be? Patient, you have to be honest with people. Are you savvy? People are coming to you because they want your savvy in terms of helping them navigate their career. They may be somewhat naive. They're not looking for a naive mentor who's not going to be able to, help them work their way through the system. And discretion is really important. People are going to tell you all kinds of, personal or professional issues. You have got to be discreet about what you're told and keep it confidential. Now, this, I think, is a lesson I learned, and it's really tough when you first start because you're going to be almost the same age as the people in your lab when you first start a lab. And it's this was from, also from one of the books, anyway, the Burroughs Welcome Book. One of the lessons is that my job is not to be their best friend. My job is to be their mentor, and my job is to be their boss or supervisor. I had this sort of egalitarian thing where I was trying to run a professional laboratory, but I was also wanting to be buddies with everybody. I've come to realize the alternative is to have a little distance. Things work better if it's clear that I am the head of the lab. This is really true. So I made the mistake early on with two mistakes. One is to talk about people in the lab quite a bit to other people in the lab. It gets back to people really, really quickly, and then there's a lot of hurt feelings. The other thing I think you don't realize is that the weight of your words is much greater as a PI. I've said some offhanded things to people, just kind of teasing or joking around, and seriously, like 6 months later, they'll come back to me and say, it really, injured me when you said this, and it, impacted my reputation with other people around, and I was like, I was just teasing, and you just don't think about the weight of your words when you're training people, and because they're dependent upon you in many ways. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. Now, the flip side of mentoring is motivating people. And you have to think about whether you're going to use a stick or a carrot, i.e. are you going to incentivize people in a nice way, or are you going to be a little bit, kind of a taskmaster. Now, I'd say probably most people are kind of a combination of both, depending on the individuals and also depending on the needs. As a grant deadline is approaching, and you really want people to do some experiments, it's not like, hey, do you feel like doing this experiment this week? It's like, please, just, get on it and do that experiment. So, it's the best thing is generally like we're all in it together. I think the people in the lab need to realize that like, your success and their success, rises and falls together. Now, often you're going to have projects going badly. It's really tough when some things in the lab are working great and some things in the lab are just really not going well. And if a person has a bad project, first of all, you have to think, is it the project? Sometimes really you've given them a dog of a project and you really need to, back away from that. Is it a personal problem? I mean, I've pulled people into my office and said, what is going on? You were so productive and now, nothing is happening. And then, sometimes it'll be like, oh my God, this personal problem at home, this family problem, etc. And then, I think you just have to say, okay, well, I'll let you go through that. Please let me know, what's going on. Sometimes it's just a bad match for the project or person. I think about this. We used to do these things where people were micro-injecting eggs with, DNA or protein. This requires a very steady hand and a huge amount of patience. I mean, I tried it myself a few times, and the eggs, just kept rolling off the stage. It's not something that I ever got good at. But there were some people in the lab who were really patient and really good at it. So you need to have people technically and also kind of intellectually that fit well with their projects. And the other thing you really have to face is sometimes it's just your fault. You've given them a bad project, you've given them bad advice, you haven't helped them appropriately, in which case the best thing to do is just to say to the person, terrible project, terrible match, let's put you on something else. So there's different ways you can manage your group. I think most groups have lab meetings of some sort. The format is a little bit different for some people. Some labs have, every person present every week, just a brief, 15-minute snapshot, 10-minute snapshot. Some people have formal lab meetings where it's almost like a PowerPoint presentation. And some people just have, 2 people a week where they just slap up their raw data and, really discuss it. You can think about what works best for you. I do think regardless of what venue you use, it is very important to have a venue in which you look at raw data and not just PowerPoint or Excel already kind of, massage data, because you're not going to get a good feeling for what really happened. And, obviously on rare occasions you might get somebody who's intentionally misleading, but by and large it's not that. It's that they've selected a feature of the data that they believe to be important, and you look at it carefully and you know that they've missed something or that's not the important point, or there's something that contradicts it. Small group meetings, just a couple people, individual meetings, often pep talks. I think written reports can be a good thing. Every 6 months or so, I try to have each person in the lab come in with just a bullet point list of what they've done in the last 6 months and what they're going to do in the next 6 months. It gets people to think about what's coming, and occasionally it gets people to go, oh my God, I haven't done anything in the last 6 months. So it's good for people to think about. I like for people to outline papers very, very early so that they, even if when it's only starting to be the glimmer of a paper, with the understanding that things might, go in different directions as results emerge. But I think it's good for people to think about where the experiments are going if it's going to be a paper. So I think that can be very useful. And you can have strategizing sessions. And again, you can have open door time. I think it's good for people to be able to stroll in and out, particularly when they get a problematic or a very exciting piece of data. Now, one thing that comes up in labs, I think probably once you have more than 2 people, you start getting some territoriality, where people feel like it's their project, they'd like to collaborate maybe, but they don't really want so-and-so, on top of their project, and it's your job to adjudicate, whose project is whose. You can have discussions with the individual, but I think it's really important to encourage, as early as possible, very open discussion between the people in the lab. So this was Bob Weinberg who said, I must spend 60% of my time trying to maintain a sense of harmony in the lab. I want people to get along, to cooperate. It's very difficult to do that, It's hard enough to do with your own family, but managing with 20 people is almost impossible. But really, that's what my job is all about. And as I said, you set the tone, but you're stuck with your own personality. So, you have to manage to communicate this however you can. But I think it's really important. Sometimes somebody will come up with a cool idea, they'll talk about it in a lab meeting, and they want to make sure, first of all, that no one else is going to start working on their cool idea. But on the other hand, if there's an exciting idea, you don't want them to park on it for 3 years. Somebody will just say something, and because they've said something, they think they can lay claim to it forever. So it's a balance in terms of making sure that projects get done, but that people have their own sort of intellectual property, if you will. Now, you're going to find lab morale is going to go up and down and up and down. And, you know, the people that, it's okay, it's not great when everybody's down together, but, you know, you're always going to have something that's working, hopefully. So you got someone up here when everybody else is down here. Or the lab's being really successful and you got this person where everybody else is doing great and nothing's working. So what you have to really think about, I like the word schadenfreude, it's a pleasure in the pain and failure of others. What you really don't want is when somebody sees other people in the lab fail and it gives them pleasure because it makes them look better. Now, there's always going to be some of those people, but like if you can encourage them not to articulate it, it would be a good thing, even if they're thinking it. The other thing is there's always, you know, part of that, there's always some result jealousy. I mean, I was a graduate student in a lab with 11 students when I was there. And we were all really good friends, but there was definitely this kind of gentle, you know, jockeying and competition. And, you know, the competition drove us forward, but sometimes you would be like, ooh, why didn't I think of that, you know? And so I think as a PI, it's really important to be even-handed and to really encourage people to know that everyone has his or her day in the limelight. I remember this very well. There was a student in my lab who's now a successful faculty member at Johns Hopkins. And when he was early on in the lab, one of the postdocs came to me and said, you know, he's really upset because you just don't pay enough attention to him and his project. I was like, you know, his day will come. I'm giving him a little space to develop things. Then when he was nearing the end of the time in his lab, the same postdoc came to me and said, he wishes you would stop talking to him all the time. So, you know, it's kind of, you know, you go up and down and your time comes. And, you know, I've liked to run the lab maximizing group collaborations. Not everybody likes that. I think it's great when people can work together as long as everybody's happy that they have some piece of the project. It's important, I think, to have some socializing in the lab, small talk, people have lunch together, etc. The one thing is I think you need to control your own emotions, and sometimes, you know, everybody's human. You can't always do that. People can tell when you're upset, even if you're trying to restrain yourself, and there will be times when you're upset. But I will say this, try to control your anger. I mean, when I was a postdoc at UCSD, there was another lab where the PI threw a chair at somebody that she got so mad, and like nobody wanted to go to that lab after that, you know. So like throwing things at people, no. You know? So that's like one take-home message from this presentation. So this was a quotation in Kathy Barker's book. I lost 2 years in the lab because of one incident where I lost my temper publicly. A student not from the lab told all the other students about the incident, and not one person even did a rotation with me for another couple of years. I have seen this over and over. And, you know, I can count on, you know, one hand in the 20 years that I've had a lab that I've, you know, kind of even started to raise my voice at somebody, and I've always regretted it. So it's, and the other thing, the corollary of this now in the electronic age is never write an email when you're angry. You can write it, save it to your draft, do not send it. The next day, it will be obvious that you were angry, and often you look at it and you go, ooh, I'm glad I didn't put it that way. So just never push the send button when you're really angry. This I said, no talking about one member of the lab to another member. Don't attack people personally. You know, you might not like what they're doing in the lab, but it's about their work. You don't say, you know, you're the laziest person I've ever met. Like, you know, you just don't say things like that, although sometimes it may be tempting. And again, never send an email when you're angry. So, you know, you also have to set the intellectual tone of the lab, you know, things like discussing papers. This was actually a quote from me in Kathy's lab. The quotes are all anonymous, but I'll tell you, I told her this. I hated journal clubs when I was a student and a postdoc, and I vowed never to have them when I had my own lab. You know, and I still feel that way. You know, some people really like journal clubs. I hated them. I was like, I can read the paper, you know, and talk about the paper, but somebody presenting the figures one at a time, I always couldn't stand, and I have never done it in my own lab. There was a brief period of time when people in the lab had a journal club because they wanted to have one, but I did not participate. And then, you know, I have to say the ethics question becomes really critical, particularly now with funding tight, you know, papers getting harder to publish. You have to balance between pressure and high standards and be clear where you stand. So, you know, often, you know, as a PI, you'll communicate, I really want you, this is a great idea, I really want you to do this, da, da. And sometimes you don't realize that what somebody may be perceiving is you're telling them to get a specific result. And I've had to step back a number of times in lab meeting and just, you know, make clear, look, I'm not going to contain my excitement if I think an idea is really cool, but I don't ever want that to be interpreted as I'm telling you to get that result. I want to hear what the real data are. But, you know, that can be a fine line, and I think, you know, people, you know, some of the cases of scientific fraud that I've seen over the years, luckily not in my own lab, but, in part of my administrative role and also talking to colleagues elsewhere, had to do with the fact that a dynamic was set up where the people in the lab really wanted to please the PI. And that's a dangerous dynamic to set up. It's hard not to be happy when someone gets a great result, but even if it's a fantastic result, my inclination now is to say, this is great, you should really enjoy it. And they'll be like, well, I'm not sure I can reproduce it. I'm like, if you don't reproduce it, all right, we'll figure out something else. Enjoy the moment anyway, but I think that's a tough thing to communicate. You need to think about work ethic expectations. Your hours do set the tone to some extent, although truthfully, most PIs aren't there full hours that the postdocs and students are there. You may decide people can be really flexible. I personally don't know when people are in the lab or not in the lab, even when I was down in the lab all the time, because as long as they're getting the work done, I don't care what hours it happens. Some people really prefer for everybody to be in the lab together at the same time. I think vacations are really important. I actually, when someone says to me, and I haven't taken a vacation in 2 years, I'm like, why? So I think it's really important for people to have a chance to kind of, regenerate their energy. As I said, social times are important. And, it's interesting, this comes up all the time. Can hard work compensate for raw talent? Sometimes you get somebody in the lab who's just really, really good, and they really don't have to work that many hours, and they get the great results. On the flip side, sometimes people are not great experimentalists. And, I was not a great experimentalist in graduate school, but I did the experiments over and over and over again. And I think, often in science, it really is the person who works really hard, particularly if they're not fabulous at the bench, to get the data. Something you want to think about is how people keep notebooks, whether people show you raw data versus PowerPoint presentations. As I said, I very much would encourage looking at raw data all the time. And then, this is an interesting thing that you might want to think about early on. People will get great results or interesting results that are going to be in the paper, and they want to keep moving the project forward. So they do the next experiment, the next experiment, the next experiment, and then you get to like the end of the day, you've got 10 experiments where you look at it and it makes a very nice story, but there's not a single person outside your laboratory that would believe it because the quality of the data are just not there. Where it's kind of promising, or you see a band that looks kind of interesting, and you kind of construct the whole story together. What you really want to encourage people to do is think about what their data are going to look like at the end of the day, and if they get a really nice result, but it doesn't look good, keep doing it until somebody else is going to believe it. And if you can't get it to that point, the data is going to be, questionable going forward. I think a lot of labs like to have sort of lab jobs. You make the buffer, you do this, you do that. You can think about what the best way to arrange it is. I just want to mention this. So this is my PhD advisor, Saburo Hanafusa, who passed away a few years ago, but he ran this great lab. He was like the nicest man in the world. He was calm, never got upset, etc. But one thing I really liked, and this is actually kind of lore now of all the people who've ever been in the lab, he had a lab manual that he would hand you on the day that you first joined the lab. And I think this is not such a bad idea. And it had all kinds of things in it, like, how you get ID badges and keys and all this lab policies. He talked about vacations and lab jobs and all this kind of stuff. Safety, supplies and equipment, what kind of meetings there were, lab protocols that everyone would use, reagent recipes, publications, etc. But one thing that was really, he had like practical tips in there that we all just remember. So he had, let's say you have a rack with a bunch of Eppendorf tubes and you get a phone call. Make sure you always move your tube one to the right if you're doing that. He had all kinds of nice little tips about that. How to keep your experiments moving forward in the best way possible. And I did something like that when I first started my lab. I haven't really propagated it over the years, but I thought it was a great thing. I think that, Molly, it's been about, I'm okay? Okay, so, I think it's really important in this day and age to collaborate. I would say that people can initiate their own collaborations in the lab. It's a good idea to say that everything has to be okayed by you in the end. It's always a little bit weird when you go to a meeting and someone tells them they're collaborating with your lab and you had no idea. So you can let your lab members negotiate the details if possible. One thing, that happens in lab collaborations, this is where I've seen the most authorship disputes. It doesn't often tend to be people within the lab because you're kind of controlling your environment. But if they have a student, let's say, and you have a student, and you both perceive that that person's going to be first author on a paper, that's where you start coming, bumping heads. I think it's very important to have the authorship conversations up front. I found in general, it's best when the two labs really need each other, i.e. they have different technical competencies or intellectual competencies that you put together to get a great project. What doesn't tend to work so well is you hear somebody's competing with you, you call, you both decide that you're going to collaborate, but you have the same expertise and the students working on the same thing. That's when, the authorship thing tends to come up, because you're both really making the same sort of contributions rather than have a lead lab and then a lab that's actually helping the other lab. You've got to think about outside meetings. I've always said to people, well, just tell them what you want to tell them about your project. Be open at meetings. Some people prefer people to have secrecy about their results to some extent. They're giving a poster. People don't want them to tell everything about the project to competitors. My rule has really always been, you can tell what you want about your own project, but not about other people's projects in the lab. What you don't want is someone going to a meeting and revealing the hot results of their benchmate. People tend to get upset about that, understandably. So again, you can reveal your own work, but maybe not other people's work. You have to think about scientific direction. Are you going to have one project or many projects? I have to say, in the way the NIH is set up now, in particular, you almost have to have multiple projects because you can only submit a grant 2 times. If you come to the second submission and you don't get it and you have nothing else going on, you've really got a problem. Do you want people working together individually? High risk versus low hanging fruit? Do you want to be collaborative or work solo? And do you want to be mainstream or in a unique niche? This is actually an interesting thing, because you might think that you want to occupy some really unique niche so that you don't have to worry about competition and being scooped, and you can really make your reputation in that area. The question is, how prominent is your niche going to be? Because it's a lot easier to publish things that lots of people are interested in than things that are only 5 people in the world are interested in. So you really have to balance those things. Again, know your own style, know the capabilities of your personnel. I have to say that I learned this too late in my lab, to make as many of your reagents of your own as you can. We have a couple of people who've been on multiple papers in our lab that are collaborators, which meant that I could write to them for antibody, and they never answered, and then I'd send them a note saying, can you send me an antibody, and you'll of course be an author on the paper. And then, I get a FedEx the next day. So, if we had taken the time to make those antibodies, it's not turned out to be a bad thing, but it's just, we have to bag 10 microliters at a time as opposed to having, 100 mils of the antibody. So it's worth thinking about. I think you have to these days be very publication driven. Gone are the days where you're just sort of interested in something and you really want to know the answer. You really have to want to know the answer and communicate it to your colleagues. This is interesting. I've changed my mind a little bit about this over the years, so I say don't be driven by RFAs. And what I mean by that is, these are requests for applications. The NIH or NSF or whatever will often put out calls for applications in an area in which they're particularly interested in funding, and frequently the competitiveness to get that kind of funding is a little bit less. Now, you don't want to have your research interests driven totally hopping from one thing to another because of RFAs. But on the other hand, I have to say, I've had the experience myself where an RFA has come out and I've sat and thought, what is it that we do that could be crafted to really fit this RFA? And I have to say, in a couple cases, it made me come up with really interesting and novel syntheses of different things that we've done that then successfully attracted funding. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. And I've always really liked it when people in the lab come up with great ideas. My rule is it has to have something to do with cell cycle or cell death, because I'm not looking for a totally another area to work on. But I think people really are passionate about and own projects when they've come up with the idea themselves. Obviously, they need to discuss it with you. And then the last thing is, one last thing I'll talk about is publication. As I mentioned, sometimes you're going to have to hit singles. How high to shoot. You don't want to get scooped. And the other question is, how tolerant are you of rejection? There's no harm in going to higher level journals if, first of all, you're not in danger of getting scooped, and second of all, you're not going to be depressed if it gets rejected. Because sometimes you try and it works. But if you're somebody who's going to, and you may not want to waste a year. Some of these journals can take a year by the time you do all of the revisions they ask for, and they can still reject it. So it's worth bearing in mind. So sometimes, some people do least publishable units. I think that's not good either if it's so minimal that people won't view you as having made a substantive contribution. And so you need to think about those things. You need to think when you're ready to write the paper and who writes it. Often the student or postdoc will draft the paper. People have different styles. Sometimes people will go back and forth like 8 or 9 times to hammer it out. My style's been to have the person draft the paper, and then I just edit it heavily and then send it back to them, and they might or may not agree with what I have to say. So, everybody can do what they think is best. Finally, getting money. Getting money has become a very big thing these days, obviously. You have to strategically plan what grants you're going to write. I recommend the saturation bombing strategy. You can try all available sources. I have to say, my first 3 years, I did not get an R1, but I wrote every little grant that I could find, and I kept my lab supported financially until I got an R1. And then as soon as I had a window to write a second R1, I wrote another R1. And I think you just really have to be on top of it, particularly because there are funding sources available to starting PIs that are not available later on. And you really want to capitalize on that, and make sure you can access those funds when you're still eligible. As I said, the other thing is you really want advice and critical input. The more people you can get to read your grants and comment, the better. If there are people you trust who have savvy and a good grant track record, do not give it to people 3 days before it is due. It is a good practice to have your grant done a month before the deadline, so you can ask people to read it in about a week, and it gives you 2 or 3 weeks to revise. Some departments have gone to that formally. I know in pharmacology and cancer biology, Donald McDonald instituted a program where he'll actually send your grant out for external review if you get it to him a month in advance. This has been hugely important for people on the faculty. And then last thing, obviously, is time management, and if somebody has any good ideas about that, I'd definitely like to hear them. And with that, I think we're going to a panel. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, now we have our panelists. So now we're going to move to the questions. And once again, our panelists today are Dr. Mohammed Noor, who is representing an academic lab that's housed in an arts and sciences department rather than a school of medicine. Dr. Jessica Monserrat, who is a scientist at Bayer Crop Science, and Dr. Susan Smith, scientific investigator at Stiefel. Did I say that right? Stiefel or something? Okay. A GSK company. So perhaps the first question is, Susan and Jessica, could you speak a little bit about how industry labs differ from academic ones? We've heard that industry labs are more restricted than academic ones. Would that be true? And then, sorry? Oh, yeah, oops, sorry. We don't have microphones, so we'll just speak up. And then Mohammed, maybe you could talk about how things are different in a arts and sciences lab.
Should I start? Yes. I haven't personally found it that much more restricted. I think we're a little bit slower to publish, especially if it's a clinical candidate or we think it's going to go to clinic. But I've also had the opportunity to publish, and I'm working on a manuscript now, so I haven't found it more restricted in that way. One of the differences, I think, is that because it's so goal-oriented, we find that everybody in the lab is working towards the same goal. So we don't necessarily have individual projects the way you would for a postdoc or student. However, it's still important, maybe for the morale and peace of mind, that everybody kind of has their own niche that they're working on. So you may be working on the same goal, but it's not a full-fledged project for each person, but it would still be that they have their own piece of the pie.
I think in my view, it's one of the differences that is pretty big is that you will tend to be doing science in assay development. So you're trying to figure out how to make your assays more sensitive, more high throughput. So that's kind of where most of your creative juices are flowing, rather than doing this very detailed, this protein interacts with this protein and activates the signaling pathway. I mean, that's obviously part of it, but the main purpose is developing the most sensitive and most high throughput assay that you can. And so that's where we spend a lot of our time.
So ours is actually very similar to what Sally described on average, but it's tricky because arts and sciences labs can vary quite a bit depending on the type of science being done. If you're a cell development lab, there's probably no particular difference in terms of how science is done. In fact, some of our faculty were in the med center or have moved to the medical center, so there's really no difference there at all. If in contrast you're sort of, say, from the ecology side or something like that, there, a lot more of the science is done solo. It's rare that the students are doing exactly what the advisors are doing. They sometimes have to get their own funding, things like that. So in that sense, there's a lot more individual work that has to happen there. In some sense, they're almost more like a postdoc because they have to figure out a lot more on their own. Often, also in college innovation, they often go directly into a lab rather than doing rotations. So the science there is generally sort of different in that regard. One critical difference, though, between medical center and arts and sciences, our teaching loads are, of course, much larger. That, if you're a faculty member in arts and sciences, most of the academic year you are teaching. It's not like you're teaching for a couple of weeks and then you're off. But you're pretty much doing it all the time. On the other hand, we have 9 months of guaranteed salary. So that's pretty good, especially in times like now when I just got an email yesterday from somebody from my former postdoc who's on a grant panel at NSF in my division, and she said that the expected funding rate for that panel for this year is 3%.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point that someone submitted this question: with grant money harder to get, labs are getting smaller, how do you motivate or incentivize lab technicians, students, or postdocs to do more, work harder, or work later at night or during weekends? That was exactly
I mean, that's always a hard thing. I think that obviously part of your job is to get people very excited about what they're doing.
Yeah.
There's no way you can, no one's going to want to come to your lab if you tell them, like, I want to see you here at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. I do think there is something, though, to the realities of the situation of communicating to people how important it is that the lab, get this funding or get this paper. But again, it's kind of a fine line between pressuring people and getting them to buy into the mission as a collective. So, and unfortunately, I think occasionally, and I see someone from my lab here who will recognize this, sometimes you need something for a grant because the reviewers ask for it that you will probably never publish because it's sort of a stupid suggestion, but you really have no choice. Those are hard to motivate people to do. But, it has to be, well, look, I need your help on this, and I'm going to really help you get a paper on, whatever. It can be tough.
So Sally, and this is kind of another downer question, and you sort of touched on this, but so how exactly do you fire an unproductive worker? Because it seems like they often don't get fired and then they just hang around and it makes things worse for everybody else.
I'm so bad at this. Maybe Muhammad should say something.
I've only done it twice. It's not, obviously it's not fun. Pretty much everybody I know who has fired somebody has always said, God, I wish I'd done that a lot sooner. We tend to put it off. We try to have faith that maybe it'll get better. Maybe it'll get better, maybe it'll get better. Depends on the person who it is. I mean, if it's an undergrad, no offense to undergrad, if it's undergrad, you can just say, don't come back. There's very little HR consideration in that regard. There are legalistic aspects, and if it's somebody like, it's a technician or it's a postdoc, I mean, the immediate thing you'll hear from your HR department is document everything all the time. And in fairness to them, and also for legalistic reasons, you have to give them a lot of warnings. It can't just be one day you're fed up and that's it, you're out the door. But you have to be giving them, throughout this period of time, a milestone saying, I expect you to do this. This has been a problem. You need to be doing this. And then when over and over again they fail to do it, it both becomes legally easier, but also technically it's easier than just in the sense of, well, you've seen these milestones. You've clearly seen this coming. It didn't come out of the blues. It's still never fun, though. It's still very miserable.
I will add one thing to that. I have had several occasions where, students have left science like in the middle of their graduate career. And, I've had 3 experiences of this where I just knew that the student was going to be unhappy the rest of their lives, in science. And, in all cases, I've called them in like on a, Friday afternoon and said, look, it doesn't look like this is what you really want to do, that this is working for you. I'm not kicking you out of the lab, but go home for the weekend and think about this carefully. Is this what you really, really want to do? And in all 3 of those cases, they came back on Monday and were like, thank you, I don't want to do this, and can you help me get something else? So I think, and actually just as a funny aside, recently I asked someone in my lab to meet me on a Friday afternoon just because it's the only time I have, and they were like, I'm not being fired. No.
I would say, actually, if I could add one thing to that, one of the greater challenges isn't somebody who's not going to make it, but almost at some level, somebody who can make it, but barely with a lot of help. That's at least in my mind, that's the hardest case, because you never know. Like, well, okay, if I invest a ton constantly, I can barely carry this person through till, they go on to another postdoc or whatever, but is that fair to them? Is that fair to you? So the discussion sounds like there's an excellent idea in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it can be hard. The other thing is, I did have to let someone go, not because it's hard also if someone's really good and you really like them and you just can't afford that area of research. Now with funding getting tight, you actually have to have people with skill sets that match what your funding is. And if it's just, not going to be a good match, sometimes you really have to help people to find something else.
Jessica and Sue, do you have any experience with this in industry?
No, I think what we do is when there's a rating scale and if they are underperforming, then you sit down and you evaluate with that particular report what's going on. Is there something else that's more interesting to them? But usually we try to work out a method of maybe they go into a different group, with different kinds of scientific activities. But I haven't seen anyone. No, I haven't seen anyone fired. So
I would echo what Mohammed said, that you document everything, so HR is a little bit more involved when it comes to that. That they don't want you saying, oh, I think I had that conversation with them in January or February or whatever. They want to say, okay, I had this on February 10th, and so if you have the conversation where I expected you to meet this milestone and you didn't, shoot an email after that conversation and just say, this is what we talked about. If you disagree, if you have anything you want to add to the conversation, get it in the email, get it in writing. And also just to keep in mind that it's very difficult and it's very uncomfortable to have those conversations, but having that person be unproductive and unhappy in the lab is impacting the productivity of everybody else. And so it's really just a matter of, how much time do you want to drag this out while you're impacting the productivity of everyone?
So again, on the funding, have any of you participated in collaborations between academia and industry? Do you see these becoming more common?
yes, we do a lot. We actually fund a lot of academic labs. I'm starting one with a lab in Nebraska. We have one in Spain, and I have another one in Tennessee. And it's actually been very helpful for us. We give about $100,000 a year for them to do a certain set of experiments, and they all, of course, are very aware that limited publication is likely, so, and exposure, they can't report in conferences until we've given them okay. So yeah, we do a lot of that.
I think you really need to, I was going to say, you need to check the rules of your institution on that, because for instance, at Duke, you cannot collaborate with industry if there's an absolute block to publication. I think a vetting is fine, but some companies might say you can never publish this. Duke doesn't accept those contracts.
Yeah, and it's the same in industry. We need legal to approve. We've got all the, what type of collaboration and stuff like that. But I've had the wonderful experience of being able on both sides. So during my graduate career and my postdoc, I collaborated with industry then. And now on the industry side, where we also collaborate with academic labs. And I mean, it just seems to work really well. It's a good partnership.
And now it's also a great source of funding, particularly as industry is downsizing their R&D often. They're using academia more as kind of an incubator, and it doesn't cost them as much money, and it really helps academic labs quite a lot.
I will say what we've seen is sometimes we would approach academic labs, and I think because of the tightness of funding, that they view us just as a bank, and
right,
they ask for really exorbitant, like, okay, we can do those 2 experiments for you, but it's going to cost, $500,000, so it's a partnership on both sides.
And there's a give and take, obviously. Yeah. The lab isn't able to publish, so therefore we kind of give them a little bit more money so that they can do something that is interesting that could eventually go into a publication route. But it also does help because it's fairly likely that if the postdoc or graduate student who works on this project, it's very likely that we would hire them because they already have all kinds of expertise in what we were trying to develop. So it does give that nice channel if that individual is interested in pursuing an industry profession.
We've had the opposite where we do want to publish, and so we either give a tool compound, something that we don't mind, or we say you can publish this, but you can't give the structure, you can't give the name. So we restrict what they can say about it, but still sort of either we're going to publish it, it might take 6 more months than you want, but understanding that the postdoc who's working on it also has their own career and want to support them.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question from the list, and then we'll open it up to the audience. You all have children, so Jessica, you have young twins, Sue, you have 4 daughters, yeah, working on a 3rd. Can you talk a little bit about time management in that regard?
Pick your spouse very carefully. You know, for us, it really worked because my husband's also a professor here, and we really could share the child care. I think it's really difficult, and the full brunt of child care, you know, falls onto one individual, so I think it really helps to be able to share and balance. And academia is actually a great career for having children because your schedules tend to be very flexible. So when, you know, the principal calls because your child's done something or got sick or something, you can run over there very frequently, which can be difficult in other, you know, other careers. The other thing that I think Mohammed and I have talked about before is, you know, I would say buy what you can buy, i.e. if you don't want to clean your house, you're now, you know, you have a faculty position, hire somebody to help you clean your house, or hire somebody to help you pick up your kids.
Every penny.
Yeah. So, you know, I think things like that you can do so that the time you spend with your family is really high quality time, as opposed to, you know, running around and, you know, mopping dog hair up off the floor or whatever. I think it really makes a difference. And I think, you know, most people I know say that, like, they would really have regretted it if they didn't spend the time with their kids that, you know, they really wanted to spend. So I think, you know, it's just, you have to be efficient when you're at work, and so that when you're home, you can, you know, actually spend time with your family. Although I will say that my daughter used to say that I had, like, she could tell I would be emailing and I had different tones in my, like I wasn't listening at all, you know, etc. So, you know, she learned to interpret that as like, stop that, listen to what I'm saying, you know. So you sort of, as they get older, they get a little bit more savvy, and, you know.
But what I do appreciate about my kids is I think they've gotten me out of like office politics. So I don't linger as much, or I don't chat with and find out what's going on, which groups are fighting each other, which people are having issues. I don't have time for any of that. And when I go to work, I go do what I gotta do. Everything is like 15 minutes. This is what I gotta do, this is what I gotta do. So I see people in the halls and I wave, oh, I'm so happy to see you, hope everything's going great, see you, gotta go. Yeah.
It's really important to have routines with your kids too. So,
Oh,
you know,
yeah,
you have
definitely.
think of it like an appointment. You know, I've got an appointment with my son from 1 to 4 on Sunday. And, you know, even if I were to do it, you know what? That work will still be there at 5. You know,
That's
Plan activities.
and treat it the same way you treat a regular appointment. Don't like, well, I've got this, so I'll just cancel. No, it's an appointment.
You can't go back on what you say.
Yeah.
We're going to the museum Sunday
Yeah,
morning,
that's it.
you're going to the museum,
Right.
and nothing can take that away.
So I had the conversation with my husband yesterday where I said, I think I'm managing my time a lot better now that I'm in industry. And he was like, that's a matter of... but I will say that I have specific days where I'm home. I may work again at night, but that's after the kids are in bed. So I come home and I'm there. It's just like an appointment. So no one expects me to answer emails or do anything between the time that I get home from the time until the time the kids are in bed. And if I'm too tired at that point, I just don't deal with it until the next morning. So I think it's been nice.
Questions? Yes.
I have a question about data management. And so I'm actually looking to start a lab that's at a place that has master's students and undergrads. And so I feel like I'll have a lot of people coming through the lab. And what I've seen in a lot of labs, even sort of in regular research universities, is that if you ask about data from like 3 years ago, it's like, oh, email the person that did that experiment, and that person's like moved on to another postdoc or something. And so as I'm looking forward to starting a lab where I think we'll have a lot of people coming through, do you have advice on the best way to sort of store data and keep it in a way that you can sort of retrieve it like a couple of years down the road?
One thing that we've pushed a lot in my lab is to, as much as possible, use a public available archive. So obviously some things like sequence are clear cut in that regard, but there's other things like, for example, there's one called Dryad, which is actually housed here in Durham. It takes any kind of data you send. I mean, if it's from a published paper, you can send it there. And putting it there is so wonderful, not just for people who ask you for data, you can say like, well, there's the link, go look it up yourself. but also just for us, because like you said, I mean, you sometimes want that data yourself too, and that postdoc is like left science and working someplace.
Yeah, so the side drive is stuff that hasn't been published, like it's sort of like
unpublished.
So I've started to, this is very recent, like before we send out a paper, I obviously want to see all the primary data again, but I'm trying to get everyone to deposit their primary data, that anything that went towards a paper in, on the lab server. So that, in a folder of theirs, so we can go back and look at the complete data set and not just the little piece they cut out, to put in the paper. We've really just started that. I think a kind of corollary of that also is that I was not good at, and that we're working on now, is really a very stringent reagent catalog and, a way of system, because, we wind up regenerating things that we did 10 years ago because nobody can find them. And I think, really being organized in that respect it is important. Now, putting in some kind of database to start with that, you have data provenance, you can see where things are done, when they're done, et cetera, I think is a great thing to do. We just didn't do it.
I had that experience too. So in my postdoc, we also had shared drives or lab servers where most of our data should be deposited, because you could lose your computer, people take their laptops home, hard drives crash or whatever. So it was not only a backup of the data itself, but it also helped with integrity because it's kind of open access. Anyone in the lab has access to that, and that should be where your raw data is. And now we have all electronic notebooks, and pretty much anyone on the team can access anybody else's data. So I am strongly in support. It's just there and available to you as the PI, but also to other lab mates if they need it.
So this is.
I have a few.
Oh, sorry. Do we? Okay.
So I heard from somewhere that one of the best predictors of tenure track faculty success is how well they manage the distraction of teaching in the first several years. So the quicker you get your prep time down to, it was like something like 150% of the time you actually spend teaching, the larger success rate end up having, because then you can use that time for other purposes. I was wondering if there are any other kind of time suck pitfalls that, that end up people that you observed, young PIs, spending way too much time on issues or things that may not actually be integral to them getting tenure or them having success in that process.
That's a great
Question. I mean, from my experience, I think, you can't, first of all, you have to learn to say no to some things, obviously. But a lot of service, people will come to you to ask you to be on committees, et cetera. And it's not quite what you're asking me, but my recommendation is to try to gear your service to things that you're actually really interested in and that are going to benefit you in some way. So, for example, if you're at a place with a lot of graduate students and you're asked to participate in graduate admissions, that's, going to help you. If, you're asked to be on a committee on, policies for, I don't know, electronic journal subscriptions for the library or something, that's a very important thing. But more senior faculty can be taking that up. It's not going to be something that you need to do as a starting junior faculty. So I think you need to learn to say no, and you need to pick committees that are not going to be too onerous for you and that are going to have some, dovetail in some way with what you're trying to do in your research. Let's say microscopy is really important to your work and there's a governance committee for the microscopy facility. That's something you might want to do because you're really going to want to help to direct, where that facility is going. And I think, when people say yes to everything, or get involved in a million things, it's a problem. I will also say things like grant review, if you get a chance to, like ad hoc on an NIH panel, great. If they ask you to be a permanent member, they usually don't do that before tenure, but other agencies might, I would say no, because it's a huge amount of time. You want to get a flavor of things, but not wind up so committed that you don't have time to do, what you need to do.
I agree completely. The one thing I'd also add to that is if you mess up, let's say you did commit yourself to too much, talk to your chair and backtrack. And just say, look, I really feel like I don't have enough time to get my research done because I'm on this, this, and this. And your chair will tell you one of two things. They'll either say, that's actually 1/3 of what all the other professors are doing, which hopefully won't be the case, or they'll totally respond and say, you're right, let's let's take you off these 3 committees, just worry about this, I'll assign somebody else to it. So, you know, especially as assistant professor, feel very comfortable doing that. Because again, it's in the university's interest, the department's interest, the chair's interest that you get tenure. So, I mean, they'll want to work with you on that.
Just consider, are there any corollaries in industry you get asked to do outside things that?
There are tons of meetings, but you kind of have to go to them. Well, the meetings that I go to, you just have to go.
Yeah, I would echo that. There are also times when they're like, we would really like your input on this project that you're not really responsible for. And those are the ones that you're like, you know, I want to be a good citizen, I want to be, help out as much as I can, but do I really need to be at that meeting? So do I need to spend 2 hours in that meeting as opposed to give me the highlights if you need my input on available help? So you have to balance between, being someone people that want to work with and being a good citizen, but at the same time, protect your time.
Yes. Go ahead and get garnished. I was just wondering, as far as industry goes and getting a job in industry, how common is it for people to have postdocs? I know you go to California, but is it like because you just got a postdoc because you weren't sure whether you wanted to do industry or academia, or is it kind of required now for industry?
I would say it depends. So it would depend on what position you're targeting. If you're sure that you want to go to industry, you can do an industry postdoc, or you can do a very truncated postdoc in academia, or you could try to go directly from your PhD. But it depends on what the people are looking for, what the hiring manager is looking for, and if you have that skill set. So often a postdoc is important to gain the additional skills and requirements. I took a very long postdoc in academia, and it didn't hurt me necessarily.
I did a postdoc as well, and I think it helped me. I think when it comes to getting into industry, you usually come in as a scientist and then you work your way up. It's rare that you go straight into a group lead position, and if you do get into a group lead position, you usually should have like an assistant professorship position, which is where they're really trying to attract you for that niche field that you occupy. But once you're in, usually the PhDs, they're expected to be leaders, and depending on, and also because you're more expensive than a master's or or just somebody who has a bachelor's. So it's a chance for you to get in. When you get in as a postdoc or a scientist position, you go ahead and say whether or not you want to go in the managerial route, and you just start exemplifying that kind of behavior and show them that you have a leader qualities inside of you, and they'll definitely foster that.
So I'm just curious, and maybe this only applies to a few people who might be in clinical sciences, but can you guys speak to challenges starting a lab if you don't transition to a different institution from where you completed your training? i.e. you having to start up?
Yeah, that's a challenge if you have no startup money. I think in that case you have to make really good partnerships with other groups. Obviously you can write grants, et cetera, but that's not going to be easy to do at the very beginning. I think, first of all, I think that even if you're coming from the same institution, obviously it would be good to negotiate some sort of startup money if they really want you to have a serious research effort. But particularly for clinicians, who might have, like, let's say, less than 50% effort for research time, I think it becomes really critical to establish partnerships with other labs that are working in the area. Now, obviously, you're eventually going to have to develop your own sort of at least semi-independent line of investigation, but it's really hard to start an independent research career, particularly in wet lab research, if you don't have any funds. You're going to have to link up with somebody else. Now, clinical research is a slightly different thing because you could be part of a team or an ongoing team already. So that's a little bit maybe easier, but I think those partnerships you make up front are going to be really, really important, and also finding the right mentors who will enable you to carve out a piece that can be yours or give you some academic identity. But I think going it on your own, if you're coming from the same institution and you don't have any startup funds, is really going to be a big mistake.
Yes. Sorry to bring this back to a depressing topic, but if and when you have to fire a student, do you have any advice as to, or opinions of, do you tell the rest of your students? What conversations do you have with them to keep the morale kind of up?
Yeah, I think you have to do that.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't call them together as a group and tell them, but I would call the other students in individually, largely to explain that it has in no way reflects on their situation and they should not worry about it, because that's the worst thing if everybody looks and says, well, if they fired so-and-so, what am I next? I think you really have to sit down with each individual, explain that there were, you know, you don't have to go into the details because you don't want to put the other person, the person being fired, in an awkward situation. But you can sit down and say, you know, it really just wasn't working out, or I didn't have funding for them, or whatever. Generally, I would be very surprised if the other people in the lab don't already know what the reason is. In other words, you don't tend to fire somebody out of the blue. There tends to be some issue that everybody in the lab is aware of.
Totally agree. I have nothing to add. That was
Great.
Another depressing question. with the funding climate, so obviously if your funds dry up, you can lay off a postdoc. With a graduate student, you sort of have more of an obligation to see them through their dissertation. So especially when you're starting out, how do you budget 4 or 5 years down the road in terms of deciding how many graduate students you can take on versus the risk of getting funding or not?
So some places have specific rules on that. The decision may not even be fully up to you. So for example, here at Duke, through several programs like the University Program of Genetics and Genomics and some others, you have to guarantee X fraction of money for the student, or else that, you know, basically that student's not allowed to affiliate with you. So in that sense, it may be sort of off the table. Similarly, if you're in arts and sciences, a lot of students are supported for example, biology theoretically could come in and never pay at all for the graduate student because the student basically has to TA the entire time they're there. That's an unfortunate situation because that also means they're probably not getting paid over the summer at all. But there are labs where that happens. It's going to be very field dependent and program dependent in terms of what you can do. But it is important, a couple of things to do. It's very important to be fair to people in the lab. You don't want to have somebody who's getting, you know, the golden, you know, salary and this other person who's having to TA constantly and no summer salary. It's very important to be as equitable as possible and spread the wealth there. And, you know, assign projects accordingly because, again, there's a reporting aspect that, you know, basically the person's paid in terms of the percent effort with respect to those projects, so at least make it close. But generally speaking, just, you know, you do what you can and don't grow the lab if there's not much money.
I mean, places like Duke, a student never goes unpaid. So even if the faculty member in some way runs out of money, the department is the first backstop, and then there are other central backstops. Generally, the chair has to sign off on your accepting a student, which means that, you know, in reality, that means they're accepting the backstop responsibility too. So you're agreeing to do your best to keep the person funded, and the chair is agreeing if anything happens, you know, they're going to step in and fund it. So, you know, those kind of interactions make it, I think, easier for the PI, and also very clear what the limits are in terms of how fast they should grow their labs.
Yes.
So as PIs now, when did you guys know, and how did you know you wanted to become a PI?
I don't remember ever not thinking that was the goal.
Yeah, I think, you know, the options were much more restricted when we started. You know, everybody in the lab wanted to be a PI. It was the main game in town. Now things, you know, with all this sort of, you know, there's so many more diverse jobs available. There's a lot more focus on educating people about diverse jobs, but I just think it was a different psychology. I think everybody came in, and that was like the root and the expectation.
That was exactly it. Exactly it.
I actually want to reiterate that for industry. I still want to be a group leader, and I consider that a PI position. So, I mean, it's the same goal. It hasn't ever changed.
So like, since you were undergrad or a graduate student, or you guys knew you wanted to become a PI?
Since going to graduate
I
school.
think graduate school, when I saw what it was.
I didn't know I could do a PI at industry, and so it's actually fun because you don't have to worry about grants.
Yeah.
And you're giving money away to other labs, so it's really nice. And I've only been doing this for 2 months, so I'm kind of still new to the game. But I never saw myself in industry. I thought that I was going to do the academic route. But I really enjoyed basic science, so it's harder. basic science.
Is there a question about academia specific or just
It
PI?
could be anything, I guess, but, now there's much more diverse options, right?
Yeah.
So if you guys know now, or when you guys became PIs, that was the obvious choice because that was the only choice. Do you have any suggestions now that there are a lot of options for us that would be good indicators that like we should be a PI, or maybe it's not the best choice for, based on these reasons?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would definitely recommend talking to as many people as possible if you're considering alternative careers. Because, like in my own lab, people have gone on to do lots and lots of different things and, kind of helping them make the connections with people. But, I think now to be a PI, the driving force has to be, are you passionate about the science? And are you willing to kind of, put in the really hard work and effort? In other words, is the doing of the science important enough to you that you, can kind of deal with sort of the increase in compliance, the more difficult funding environment, et cetera? And if the answer is yes, somebody's going to do it. I would say, go for it. But you have to be dedicated to doing it. And, I think after the initial years, it gets a lot easier. But, the first couple of years are definitely difficult.
A plug for Molly, she can help you find the people that you need to talk to for informational interviews or whatever if you want to explore these other options. Now, I took advantage of that while I was at Duke, and I had some informational interviews where I was just like, yeah, that is not what I want to do. I want to be, I want to run my lab. I
Definitely
stay
take
with
advantage
science.
of Molly's resources
Absolutely.
from
Yeah.
top to bottom. She did my mock interview for my position at Bayer, and she was fantastic. Duke is a fantastic resource.
Thank you. Checks in the mail. And that's of course if you're a postdoc. If you are a graduate student, then you have the services of Duke Graduate Career Services, Paul Michelli in the back, and our Assistant Dean for Graduate Student Professional Development, Melissa Bostrom. So they are also wonderful resources if you are a graduate student. Okay, next question. In the back, you've been waiting for a while.
Hi. Could you speak a little bit about how to manage a budget and how much time you spend thinking about budgeting towards equipment, or how did that sort of start at times?
Great question. Yeah, so it's different depending on what the budget, what it is. So when you first get there, let's assume university and all, whatever the others can speak in terms of industry, you have to start. Before you even get to start, you have to have actually submitted some sort of budget to the university. They don't just give you a random pot. You have to set something up. So you have at least have thought about it vaguely. You're clearly, to be blunt, you're not going to do exactly what you said in your startup request. You're going to do something different. Same with grants, though. Again, you're going to budget something out. You're going to know at least what fraction is going to personnel and say, I have a postdoc, this is the fraction for that. I mean, the only thing that I watch carefully for the budget, I figure the personnel lines, they are what they said. That I'm giving this person this much money because I promised them to give them this much money. So that's kind of automatic in the sense that I know exactly when it ends and hope there will be another pot of money at the other end of that. The thing for me at least is usually supplies, travel, things like that. It's usually, as long as you're not going crazy, I just sort of don't watch it carefully until it gets closer towards the end. So we get statements and you can ask for statements periodically, but it's not something I spend a huge fraction of time on by any means. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think with startup at the beginning, one thing that's important is to really look what equipment your department has and like what's in core facilities, et cetera. I think people often feel like it's necessary to own everything themselves, and that's usually not the case. So it's better to say, you may go in with 3 or 4 other PIs to, purchase some major piece of equipment. We have, a lot of the departments here are very active with grant projection tools, and I think that's really nice to have an administrator that has a grant projection tool. So basically, I don't worry about like the line items, but I do look at the bottom line and how it's changing with the grant projection tool. I will say something else, which I think probably not everybody likes, but I kind of learned this from our previous chair, Tony Means, which is I try to set like a spending limit for each person in the lab each month, and so they have a dollar value that they're shooting for that our budget can bear in terms of supplies. Now, sometimes they go over and people will say, I'm trying to finish a paper, and there's definitely exceptions, but also people in lab can borrow from other people in lab. So it kind of keeps the total constant, but it basically at least gives you something to shoot for, because I've seen in labs where, everybody wants their own tube of antibody, everybody wants their own tube of whatever, and that can quickly spiral out of control. And in the first year I put that dollar limit, for each person, we saved $140,000. So that tells you how much duplicative waste was going on.
In industry, I don't spend a lot this has never been my strong suit, so I don't spend much time. I need at the beginning of the year to project how much I think I'm going to spend, and then put that forward, and so we're not writing grants, but there is someone else who's controlling the budget that I ask permission. So I would say, this is what I need for these types of external activities, and I'm looking for approval, and I would get a response back that says I have approval for that. The biggest and the tightest thing, at least in our industry, is headcount. So people, and it's not that they're the most expensive part, it's just that it seems to be the most restrictive as far as, who you request from. But it's very lucky we have project managers that really track the budget, so I can always go to them and ask, where are we with regard to my project? But no, I don't spend much time on that.
We just write up a report of what we want and need, and it almost always gets approved. And at the end of the year, they ask us to spend more, so. Sorry. Sorry.
It is very important to watch expiration dates, because those sometimes will creep up on you in terms of like startup, even too. Some universities will have a startup expiration date. You want to have it where, hey, guess what, your startup just, you had 100,000 left, but now it's gone.
They really don't like it if you're consistently at the end of the year coming up with, I have to spend a whole bunch in November and December. So it's good to be cognizant of where you are kind of mid-year. Yes.
In each of your 4 cases, your time was a pie chart. Can you highlight the biggest pieces of your time?
So mine is constantly changing, but in the last maybe 2 months, it seems that 90% of my time is in meetings, which is, so I'm really at the point where I'm ready to start backing off and saying I need to protect more and more of my time. But yeah, at least 90% of my time is in meetings of some sort or another, or preparing for the meeting. Meetings.
It's not meetings, thankfully. I'd say, so it varies by semester for me. So the spring is my heavier teaching semester. I mean, up until right before spring break, I had 2 classes, one of which had almost 500 students. So probably for that period, it was probably on the order of 15% was teaching, just by itself. And then beyond that, the other quarters would be 1 quarter would be administrative things for the department, and 1 quarter would be meeting with people from my lab in terms of research.
Yeah, for me, it's a little different because I've had a job that's 50% administration in the vice dean job. So, then I have the 50% that's dedicated to lab, and that's kind of, a random mix of like, meeting with people in lab, working on papers, grant writing, et cetera, just depending on how things are going. So I would say it's pretty fluid from, week to week.
As you mentioned, the teaching isn't actually like in the classroom 20 hours a week. It's not like, but it's things related to teaching. So making the stupid tests, just so much time. Oh my gosh! And then preparing for class, going through things, meeting with the TAs, all that it all adds up.
And in the medical school, we do not that much teaching. So there are periods of time when I'll be doing some graduate teaching, but I don't have any undergraduate teaching load, so it's a very different.
You got a question? Yeah. I would like to ask how specialized you have to be. I was under the impression you really do better in an academic environment when you're really, really focused down to even a pathway or something. You're really a specialist in your area. Is that also true in industry, or is it more important to be more broad-minded in that area?
I found it's very helpful to be broad-minded. Projects can shift, priorities can shift. So it's good to be flexible enough that you can move from one thing to another. So in hiring, we're looking for people with specific expertise, but we were hoping to broadly apply them to the projects that we have.
And I think we were really, in our group, we're really trying to push innovation. So knowing a lot about new technologies, new instrumentations to make things high throughput, increase efficiency. So yeah, broad.
So I had a question, like, being a scientist, you're trained to be a scientist, work on the bench. What is it that you guys did to be a good manager? Not everybody is a bond manager or a leader. Did you do it on the go, or did you it came on your head as you became assistant professor? Like, okay, now what should I do? So,
Trial
would
and
you like to
error.
suggest
It really is on the go, I would say.
Did you do any extended professional development, training on?
I didn't. I mean, the university here does offer some, I mean, I run these workshops for faculty. I went to one once and there were like 3 other people. I mean, it seems like, at least as a new professor, you tend to feel so stretched, you don't feel like you have time to do that, even though that is most of your job.
I mean, there is the lead, like Ann Brown's office now does the leader course, and that's actually been very popular.
That's true.
And that gives some of the skills, and also, you know, has part of like a 360 assessment, so you can actually at least see where your strengths and weaknesses are. But I would say when we started, there wasn't that kind of thing available. It was really just, you know, I think there's some advantage at the beginning too. As I said, you do have to watch the division between yourself and the lab members, but because you're much closer in age to the lab members, also it's easy to establish rapport and figure out what their motivations are because you will have just come from that position. And so you understand really well what they need.
In industry, it's a little bit more formalized. So GSK has a great program for leadership and leadership expectations, and there's a lot of conversation around that. What does a good leader look like, and how do you become one? And a lot of formal workshops and courses. And maybe you propose or do some workshops on this with the 70-20-10 model and how you should split your time, how to learn what you're doing. So 70% is on-the-job training, and 20% is interactions with colleagues or one-on-one mentoring, and 10% would be formal workshops. And I think that's really applicable to management and leadership skills. So if you could work a little bit on getting the formal, it's nice to just have the formal stuff to get the language around it. So what does it mean to coach versus mentor versus manage versus, you know, those kinds of things. And then the one-on-one mentoring at every level that you're at. I would say find someone who's been through it and connect with them and see if you can have a one-on-one conversation with them on a regular basis. So that when you're in early faculty, you know, find people like Sally and Mohammed and say, you know, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing right? So similar to the 360, you can get other people's perspective on what you're doing.
I think communication is huge, obviously. And so in all of these leadership classes that we actually are required to attend, they're all kind of squishy, silly stuff that you got to do. Like, you know, you have a toy and you're supposed to be always talking with a toy in your hand. So that's supposed to relieve stress or things like that. And it's actually some of it works. But more importantly is how to communicate with somebody without making them feel defensive or stressed, because that already starts occupying too much of their brain activity and, you know, and hindering productivity and hindering creativity. So I think that's been what I've been learning that is so important, is how to effectively communicate in a positive manner and to kind of nurture engagement, nurture productivity, nurture all kinds of positive things from an individual.
Sally mentioned during her talk that you're stuck with your own personality. So there are actually tools out there to tell you what your personality is. Because we all think that our personality is the right one. Yeah, it's good to actually, if you can know what your personality is, because you may find that the perfect technician, they have all the skills you want, they've got great personality, they come with great references, but their personality may completely clash with your personality type or leadership style, and that's just not going to work well. And so it's kind of nice to be able to identify that, or have the tools available to you so that you can identify that.
And please be aware of all the resources that we have here at Duke for students and postdocs to learn these things. As postdocs, you're employees, so you're eligible to take classes through learning and organizational development. They have a lot of classes on leadership, on managing, so take those. Go to the workshops that we hold on assertive communication. Dean Bostrom just this year started the Emerging Leaders Program, which Charlotte went through, and that's a lot about learning your leadership style and your managing style. And that's open to graduate students and a limited number of postdocs as well.
Those things will really help you in those difficult conversations when you need to fire somebody.
Several departments, coming back to something Susan said earlier, several departments will assign you a formal mentor. The quality of that mentor is going to vary a lot depending on both how communicative you are with the mentor in terms of, you know, asking questions and the personality style of that mentor. My advice would be, you know, use that if you want, but just find your own. And, you know, find somebody who, you know, I want to emulate this person. So for example, when I showed up here, Philip Menifee was somebody I'd always go to and ask advice from. And I would say, well, you guys should do it this way, you guys should do that. And he'd tell me what he thought. So even though he was never assigned to me yet, he was sort of my mentor.
Yeah, I mean, almost everybody's willing to help and to talk with new faculty and to help them, you know, manage the transition.
Yes,
I was just curious about what the actual structure of the industry labs is, because we're very familiar with the academic lab structure, but the project leader, group leader, I don't know.
So I would say a group leader is very similar to a PI. In our unit, we have a department, there are 6 different groups within it, and each one of those groups has, depending on what their focus is, 3 of them are kind of biology, wet lab, and I would just consider each of those 3 team leaders or group leaders are just like PIs, and they have their people we work in the lab, or in between, or something along those lines. The project leader, so because it's matrixed, so the project leader is pushing a project forward, and they may work with several of the teams. So we have the biology groups that biology tends to run the projects, at least in our group. But you would work with chemistry, you would work with formulation, you would work with regulatory and commercial. And so you would sit at a table with all of these different fields, if you will, and say, what do we need to get this potential product from this state to that state, make it to the next milestone. And that's matrixed, whereas the group leader is more like a PI that you would be familiar with.
And under the PI, how many people, what type of skill set are working?
Totally varies, but similar in academia. So that's set by the tone of the lab and everything. And also, so within the head of the department, how many headcount they're willing to give. Our team is six people. So my boss, myself, and then 4 other bench scientists. And then some of the teams are 3 people only. So 2 bench scientists and the team leader. So it really varies.
Yes, just to kind of add on to that, so there are these groups that provide support to the program leaders. So they basically employ us. We provide service to them. So I'm the group leader for mode of action studies. So they have an interesting candidate that they want to flesh out. They shuttle it to my group, and we do all of the mode of action studies for that particular candidate gene or product, whatever they're developing. And within my group, because we do a lot of very intricate assays, we have more PhDs than other groups who just kind of do Western blots or qPCR, things like that are more routine. So we do a lot of assay development, and we have I have three PhDs under me and a master's, 2 masters.
So in our group of 6, there are 4 PhDs and 1 master's and 1 bachelor's.